right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks, and we've been talking about civil liberties and kind of stressing the idea that without freedom of expression, it's really hard to be democratic. You have to be able to respect people's rights to say things that are controversial. These are ideas that go well back into sort of certainly the ancient Greeks believed in this idea that everyone should have a right to speak. Certainly as democracy began having a greater kind of purchase in European societies and in the here in America, this idea that we should have a right to say things, it was first instantiated really in the American Constitution, in the First Amendment. That does not mean that everything is protected. You do not have a right to say things that are untrue about other people. That is, you do not have a right really to say hateful things. There was actually something that happened in a Senate committee. I can't remember if it was the Judiciary Committee or another committee, but it was a committee dealing with hate speech and the rise of hate crimes in the United States. And there were several leaders of civil rights groups from different areas, including there was a Jewish guy, and then there was an Arab Muslim woman who was a leader of an Arab group that basically advocates for the peaceful resolution of conflict and trying to avoid hate speech. And one of the Republican senators, I think his name is Kennedy, John Kennedy, basically his entire line of questioning was, "You support Hamas, don't you? You support Hezbollah." And she repeatedly said, "No, I don't. I don't support violence. I don't support terrorist groups." He nevertheless accused her in really inflammatory ways of being an advocate for terrorist groups, which is a kind of guilt by association smear that ordinarily wouldn't be protected speech. However, Kennedy is a senator. There are protections within both the House and Senate rules that called the Speech and Debate Clause that basically mean they can't be held accountable even when they say untrue things about a person. I mean, he at one point he was saying, "You can't even bring yourself to say that you don't support these people," and she had clearly already done that, and she was trying to say, "Yes, I did," and he was just like, "No, you didn't," despite whatever it was that she said. And so the challenge that we have is that we have to try and promote tolerance, but at the same time, speech can be used to promote intolerance, and that's the challenge we confront. And the remedy for offensive speech or hateful speech is not necessarily the government coming in and suppressing that speech. It is rather people to use their voices to say, that what was being said about this, her last name is Barry, what this woman, what this senator was saying about this person was offensive. It was not true. He should not have, a person in a position of power like that should not be using their position in such an abusive way. So we're going to continue talking a little bit about the First Amendment, and then we're going to talk about the Second Amendment. Then we're going to start talking a little bit about the rights of the criminally accused that have rights that are covered by amendments of the bill, within the Bill of Rights. And then we're going to talk about sort of a substantive due process issue, and that is the right to privacy, which is an implied right that when you take the Bill of Rights up in its entirety, many people believe that there is a right to privacy to be found within the combination of the amendments within the Bill of Rights. Other people argue that if it's not clearly expressed, then it doesn't exist. So we've been talking about people's right to freedom of expression, but at the same time, there are some kinds of speech that are not protected. And like I said, hate speech is not protected. Libel and slander are typically not protected. Now that raises a kind of a gray issue, and that is obscenity and pornography. So the problem with these terms is that what constitutes obscenity and pornography ultimately lies in the eyes of the beholder. For example, obscenity typically involves the use of foul language. Well, I was raised on a military installation. Ironically enough, my mom, who was the daughter of a Boston truck driver, was very adept at using profane language. So to me, profanity itself is not, I'm usually on my best behavior on the TV, but profanity is not something that really causes me to become shocked or appalled or anything like that. I have pretty thick skin when it comes to people's use of obscene or foul language. Pornography is another issue, and of course the Supreme Court ultimately, I believe in Miller versus California, struggled with how to define pornography. And the 9 justices of the court back then, they were all male at the time, spent hours in the basement of the Supreme Court building watching pornographic films, trying to figure out what constitutes, what is the defining feature of pornography. And the problem is, how do you extract what is pornographic and therefore something that should be regulated from art? Because art oftentimes has the same kinds of qualities that people find offensive about pornography. And the court ultimately came to the conclusion, as one justice said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And so that again creates a challenge related to freedom of expression, because many people argue that they should have the right to view pornography and that they are not harmed by it. There are studies out there that suggest that routinely viewing pornography does have potentially harmful effects. But nevertheless, the argument has been that this is like, other types of, drinking alcohol, for example. It's something that we tried to ban. That certainly we know that drinking alcohol, that abusing alcohol can have really consistently bad health outcomes. But nevertheless, it is something that we allow people to make those decisions about. And this reflects this liberal notion that individuals should have a right to decide whether they're going to view pornography or drink alcohol or smoke or do other things that the rest of the community may believe is not necessarily a good thing for them. And so the creation of the internet has also produced, because it's produced an entirely new kind of mode of it's almost like its own epistemological universe. The internet has created vast areas where people can view and read and look at all kinds of content. This was increasingly becoming clear in the 1990s, and Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996 as a result. Now, aspects of the Telecommunications Act, especially the ones that controlled online content, that basically said you can't post certain kinds of things online, were ultimately struck down by the court. And again, the argument was that it is up to individuals to decide. And the point was that if parents don't want their children watching certain kinds of things, that it's up to up to parents to control their children's access to the internet. And of course, now we have parental control toggles on settings for browsers that enable parents to basically say, no, we're not going to allow that. So the Second Amendment basically protects the right to keep and bear arms. Now, again, what that means, what that meant in the 18th century are subject, again, to various interpretations. Now, and I think I mentioned this in in our chapter on the Constitution and on federalism, but the politics surrounding the Second Amendment reflected the politics of, the 13 colonies at the time of ratification and up into the early part of the 19th century. And that was, again, that you had southern states whose economies were and societies were largely organized around the issue of slavery. And those southern states kept well-armed militia, and also kept what were known as slave patrols, whose job was to identify and to pursue and recapture and return escaped slaves to their owners. So when you look at the Second Amendment, I'm going to read it for you, and we're going to talk a little bit about, again, the full meaning of the sentence. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's actually, there are two fundamental, kind of clauses within that, and also another critical clause, right? A well-regulated militia, again, that is something that states organize, fund, and train, okay? The idea that be the right to keep a militia. And this came about because, again, if you recall in Article 1, that, the Constitution delegates to Congress the power to raise and support armies and navies. And, people that were against the Constitution were fearful that would basically eliminate the right of states to keep, to raise and fund and support militias. And so that creates a challenge in terms of what they actually meant by that idea of a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The second clause is actually, again, sweeping, but can be a little bit vague. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, many gun rights activists basically say the right of the people is basically a universal right. Some of them argue that it is actually a sort of natural right for all people to keep, to get access to a gun. At the same time, though, keep in mind that during this period, everybody, whether they were people that were Federalists or Anti-Federalists, believed that to the extent that a state would be protected, it would be protected by a citizen army, by people who took up arms. And that phrase, to keep and bear arms, had a meaning in the 18th century. It meant that the people have a right to become soldiers in the defense of their state and their nation. And so, it's a critical phrase, that idea of a well-regulated militia. And again, what did the framers mean by keep and bear arms? Many people believe that it meant that states had a right to form and train militias. And up until 2010, or 2008 really, the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court was that keeping and bearing arms related to the state's ability to form a militia and not to any individual right to keep and bear arms. So in 2008, in District of Columbia v. Heller, the Supreme Court struck down a District of Columbia ban on handguns, finding that the Second Amendment protected the right to keep a loaded handgun for home defense. Antonin Scalia, the Associate Justice, wrote the majority opinion. Associate Justice John Paul Stevens issued a very strong defense, and in his dissent, Stevens argued that the plain language of the Second Amendment confirms that the framers' single-minded focus in crafting the constitutional guarantee to keep and bear arms was on military uses of firearms, which they viewed in the context of service in state militias. Stevens further argued that the ratification debates over the Bill of Rights concentrated on military service rather than on individual ownership. Now, I think he's right on that. I also think that the culture and practice of American life in the early years of the Republic was that many people did have rifles that they kept in their homes. Many Americans in that period of time wouldn't have access to meat if they didn't go out and hunt for it, and so hunting was a widely accepted and widely practiced way of getting food to put on your family's table. Likewise, those people living on the frontiers, oftentimes lived on homesteads where their ability to fight off hostile attacks by either Native Americans or by home invaders was essential. And this kind of reflects our debates about gun ownership today. Really, there are very few states where even 40% of adults own a gun. And so, it's mainly people living in rural areas that are far away from law enforcement that oftentimes feel compelled to have guns in the home. And then, of course, you have hunters. I come from a family of hunters. Both my parents were Army officers. Both my parents were adept at the use of firearms. My wife comes from a region of Wisconsin where hunting is a widely spread activity. I was laughing a couple of years ago. We were waiting. I was standing outside the car, getting ready for us to leave to come back to Oklahoma, and it was the first day of hunting season. And it was early in the morning. We were trying to get an early start. It was like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And the hunting season opened at like 5 o'clock. And from 5 o'clock on, I heard rifle shots just throughout the whole time while I was waiting for my wife to get the car, finish getting her part of the car packed and ready to go. And I think that the law can accommodate both the fact that there are gun enthusiasts out there, but also that guns are dangerous weapons. I think they require training. I think people should have licensing. I think they should be required to demonstrate that they keep their guns safely, that they have a gun safe, that they have a way to keep guns away from people that shouldn't have access to them. So, gun politics post-Heller in McDonald versus Chicago. The Supreme Court incorporated the Heller decision to the states. In 2022, Associate Justice Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion in New York Rifle versus Bruin that struck down a 100-year old New York City ordinance and basically said that the only way that a regulation of firearms could be constitutional would be that if it reflected the history and traditions of American jurisprudence. In other words, if you could not find a law in the 18th century that was analogous to the proposed law, that somehow it was automatically unconstitutional on its face. Associate Justice Stephen Breyer wrote a blistering defense, basically saying that Thomas's test was incoherent, was vague, and would sow mischief, that it would create confusion. And there have been a number of decisions by district court judges basically saying we don't know how to interpret this history and traditions test. So, we're dealing with a mess, and we're also dealing with an environment where people are being killed routinely. We somehow have normalized these levels of gun-involved violence. And I should note too, it's not just that people go out and shoot other people, that you have spikes in road rage incidents where both people are armed and shooting at one another on the highways. Suicide by gun is a major source of gun-related deaths that we oftentimes don't talk about. We somehow put it to the side and focus our attention on violence. And yet, guns, the old saying is guns don't kill people, people kill people. But the reality is that guns make it easier for people to kill people, and it makes it easier for people to kill themselves. And so it's something that we should be talking about and finding ways in a public policy sense that reduce the number of gun-related deaths in the United States. It's an epidemic, and the Supreme Court should get out of the way on that. The rights of the criminally accused are based on due process of law. And again, due process is something that, again, is clearly articulated in a couple of the Supreme Court, in a couple of the amendments within the Bill of Rights, and also, of course, in the 14th Amendment, which is very important. So due process of law is the right of every individual to be protected against arbitrary action by governmental actors. That reflects a willingness on the part of government officials to respect due process of law. That's an essential democratic norm. If people in government are willing to set aside due process of law, then you are creating an environment where people's rights will begin to be routinely interfered with. One of the things a lot of critics of Donald Trump have argued that his immigration policies, his anti-immigration nativism, creates a very slippery slope towards rejecting due process of law in favor of an expedient that he prefers, which is to gather up 15 million undocumented immigrants and eject them from the country. That's a popular viewpoint, and I am disturbed that it's such a popular viewpoint, because the things he's contemplating doing would necessarily require routine violations of due process of law. And it would, while he was president, he engaged in family separation. Many of those families still, many of those parents still have not been, reunited with their children. That is a horrific thing to do. It was unspeakably cruel to take a child away from a parent and say, you shouldn't have come. Well, they came because they were desperate. And I just think it's grotesque. So the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments all include or imply this idea of due process, okay? The 4th Amendment, which again, I'll read the amendment, the relevant amendment. The 4th Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So this was intended to prevent what the British used to employ, which were known as writs of assistance. And effectively that basically meant that a governor or a general in a colonial area would just designate an officer and say, you have the right to go wherever you need to go to identify these criminals. And that basically gave them the right to beat down doors and invade people's homes, okay? So the 4th Amendment is designed to say we're not going to allow that. And ultimately the Supreme Court has held regarding searches and seizures. A search compromises the individual interest in privacy. A seizure deprives the individual of dominion over his or her person or property. The relevant case here that really kind of incorporates the Fourth Amendment to the states was a case in 1961 called Mapp v. Ohio, which actually applied the exclusionary rule, which was an early 20th century rule established by the Supreme Court, that basically said that illegally seized evidence could not be used in a court of law. The case dealt with a woman, a black woman by the name of Dalrymple Mapp, who she had ties to organized crime in Ohio. She was known to be a associate of a guy by the name of Don King, the guy with the crazy white hair that was a boxing promoter. And she was believed, it was suspected that she had a boyfriend who had committed a criminal act, and police wanted to get him. And they suspected that this guy was in Dalrymple Mapp's home. They basically invaded her home. They didn't find the suspect, but in searching the home, they found a chest that had, illegal pornographic magazines and things like that. She protested, "Look, I rent this home. That chest was here when I rented it. I don't know anything about the contents." They nevertheless arrested her, hoping to put pressure on her to reveal the location of this criminal suspect. And they prosecuted her, and obtained a conviction. The Supreme Court held that because the search, they waved a piece of paper in her hand, in her face, but they had not gone to a judge to actually, obtain a search warrant. And so, without a warrant, that search was unconstitutional. And so to tell you how what you have to do in order to be able to, for police to go knock on someone's home and say, we demand to search your home. Police have to demonstrate, first and foremost, that they have a reasonable suspicion that the individual is engaged in unlawful activity, and that there are things within their home that that could be collected as evidence of that unlawful activity. They have to go to a neutral magistrate, which is to say, a judge that does not have a case before them that deals with this particular situation. And then they have to present their belief, and that it's basically an application for a search warrant. And then the judge has to make a determination as to whether the threshold has been met to issue a search warrant. So they have to basically say, we believe that this home on such and such street is being used to produce methamphetamine. We expect that when we execute a search warrant, that we will find large quantities of pseudoephedrine-based products, chemicals used to convert pseudoephedrine into methamphetamine, large amounts of cash that can't be explained by the occupant's occupation, handguns that are unregistered to the person. These are the sorts of accoutrements that a law enforcement officer would expect to find in a place where someone was making and then distributing illegal drugs. And oftentimes there has to be a predicate for them believing that that this place is being used as a meth den. And often what will happen is you'll find a neighbor reporting, there's some suspicious activity going on at this house. The house smells to high heaven because cooking methamphetamine is a smell-inducing activity. And then you would find that there are people coming up to the house at all hours of the day, and they're just parking outside the house, and they're calling on a cell phone, and then their child is running out with something, and then they're coming back with cash in their hand. That would be for police a dead giveaway, and would give them probable cause to seek a search warrant. Okay, so those are the things that typically are going to go into getting a search warrant, and those are the things that are covered by the Fourth Amendment. Now, there have been technological change and some legal changes. The Supreme Court has allowed good faith exceptions where police may not have followed all the procedures, but showed some, some fidelity to, to due process, and thereby they have subsequently allowed that evidence in court. In the United States versus Jones, the Supreme Court held that law enforcement violated a defendant's rights when they secretly attached a GPS device to their vehicle in order to monitor their movements. So law enforcement can't do that unless they get a warrant. They sometimes can get a warrant for that kind of thing. In Maryland versus King in 2013, the court held that the use of DNA testing of arrestees could be conducted without the need for individualized suspicion. And then in 2014, in Riley v. California, police were constitutionally barred from seizing a cell phone and searching its digital contents during an arrest. They either have to secure that person's permission to search the phone, or again, they have to get a warrant. And this also relates to another Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court the law enforcement in California were using infrared scans of a house to look for evidence that they were, that someone in the home was using, like their garage or something, to grow marijuana. Because again, if you have to use like these heat lamps, or not, these ultraviolet lamps, in order to grow marijuana plants. The Supreme Court held, and Antonin Scalia, a very conservative justice, wrote the opinion basically saying that no, you have to get a warrant to do that kind of thing. You can't just scan their home and then say you have probable cause because you see a heat signature in a certain part of the house. The Fifth Amendment, I'll read the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject to for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be witness against himself, nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now there is a lot in there, right? Again, double jeopardy, again, reflects this idea that the state cannot just continually accuse you of the same crime over and over again, hoping that with a different jury they'll get a different result. This is something that I talked about in Palco v. Connecticut. In 1938, the Supreme Court held that double jeopardy was not at that time an essential right, and so declined to incorporate the clause in the Fifth Amendment. The double jeopardy clause. However, in Benton v. Maryland in 1969, the court reversed itself and barred Maryland from trying John Benton a second time for larceny. Under the Fifth Amendment, also, when you talk about a grand jury, that's again widely accepted. The grand juries, have to be the ones that actually recommend indictments. This is again something where Trump talks about the fact that he believes that it's the Biden administration launching all these cases against him. But it's actually grand juries that have heard the evidence and recommended that Donald Trump be prosecuted. Now, of course, the old argument is that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, and it is true that in the hands of very able prosecutors, grand juries can be cajoled into issuing indictments that may not necessarily stand up to close scrutiny. But that's why we have trials, right? You try the evidence and then you rely on juries, right, to come to the right decisions. One of the main elements of the Fifth Amendment is this idea that people cannot be compelled to give evidence against themselves. The case in this instance, of course, is Miranda v. Arizona, which vacated the conviction of Ernesto Miranda He was convicted of rape based on a confession that the court held had been coerced. Ernesto Miranda was not the brightest bulb in the batch. He was mentally challenged, I think is probably the correct way to put it. He had been accused of raping a young Latina girl in an Arizona town. The police basically arrested him and held him incommunicado, without access to a lawyer, without access to food or water, for a very long period of time. They kept him awake, kept questioning him, and eventually kind of harassed him and harangued him into confessing. The court, now again, he was retried, and without the confession was still convicted. He served a period of time in jail. When he got out of jail, he used to make a living by signing Miranda warning cards, because of course he was the Miranda guy. He was subsequently killed in a bar fight, and ironically enough, his murderer read their Miranda rights. And of course, the decision in Miranda v. Arizona included sort of a four-part warning. You have a right to remain silent. The second, anything you do, anything you say, can and will be used against you in a court of law. The third, you have a right to talk to a lawyer and to have him or her present while you're being questioned. And fourth, if you cannot afford to hire an attorney, one will be appointed to represent you before any questioning if you wish one. That's, and again, that last part is because of another case dealing with a related amendment. So the Fifth Amendment, again, is one of those constitutional amendments that has a great deal of important stuff in it, right? And it includes a lot of important clauses that are again, like the eminent domain clause, that are very consequential for, again, due process. The Sixth Amendment guarantees a right to counsel, and I'll read the Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by the law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with witnesses against him, to have a compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Again, there are lots of elements to this. Again, the right to a speedy and public trial. This is something that oftentimes people accused of crimes will deliberately waive so that they can delay the trial in hopes that they can make it go away. I think it's evident to anyone who's paying attention that that's what Donald Trump is attempting to do with the various trials in the District of Columbia. He's got two going on there in Florida and in Georgia. He tried to get away with it in New York, and New York, they basically said, we're not having it. You're gonna go to trial. Likewise, the idea of being able to confront witnesses. There are times where witnesses have been allowed to retain their anonymity, where somebody is, for example, an organized crime figure, and where they might have, there might be a reasonable suspicion that they would be killed to eliminate their evidence against them. The challenges surrounding the right to legal counsel, are significant. And up until 1963, many states did not provide counsel to indigent defendants. That indigence means people who lack the financial means to hire a lawyer. The case that changes that is Gideon versus Wainwright. Now again, remember, in the early 1960s, certain things had happened over the course of the 20th century that really kind of created certain kinds of social practices. And Clarence Earl Gideon was what we might call a hobo. He basically rode the rails from town to town. He would take what casual work he could get. But he was effectively a homeless person. He did have children, and he did try to send money to them. In any event, he was accused in the state of Florida of having broken into a liquor store and having stolen some cigarettes and some alcohol and stuff. He was prosecuted at trial. He requested a lawyer. The judge ruled that because the trial was not a death penalty case, not a capital case, that he did not have a right to an attorney. So he was compelled to defend himself at trial. He did what he could. He nevertheless was convicted. While in prison, Clarence Earl Gideon filed what was known as a writ in forma pauperis, which means a writ in the form of a pauper, basically requesting that the Supreme Court hear his case, that his denial of legal counsel violated his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court ultimately decided to hear the case, and they assigned a very famous constitutional lawyer by the name of Abe Fortas to actually advocate on Gideon's behalf. Fortas would ultimately, within a couple of years, end up on the Supreme Court himself. He was a close friend of Lyndon Johnson, and he was, again, like I said, a very famous attorney. And his argument was a novel one. He basically said that making judges make snap decisions as to whether a defendant in a case is competent to defend themselves puts judges in an untenable position. They have to look at a person just on, that they don't know, that they have very little evidence, very little factual knowledge about, and make a snap determination of whether or not they merit or have a right to a lawyer. Ultimately, the Supreme Court agreed with Fortas's argument, and Hugo Black, the Associate Justice that wrote the majority opinion, concluded lawyers in criminal trials are necessities, not luxuries. Due process of law demands that anyone who could have their life or liberty taken from them by a criminal process deserves to have access to an attorney. Even some of the best lawyers around, Daniel Webster, one of the great lawyers of the 19th century, when he was, got himself into some legal difficulties, said, "I'm a good enough lawyer to know that I need a lawyer." And so, and the point is that when you are a criminal defendant defending yourself, the jury and the judge will implicitly assume your guilt. That an advocate, who is not associated with you, making the case on your behalf, gives a defendant a more reasonable, constitutionally defensible, defense of their legal, situation. Gideon was retried with an attorney and ultimately acquitted. The state of Florida and other states that were compelled to retry similar cases where legal counsel had been denied, a significant number of those cases resulted in acquittals. Now ask yourself what that means practically speaking. It means there were a lot of people sitting in state and mainly state prisons who had been simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, were poor, were minorities, were members of some disfavored group who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and police kind of latched onto them. That is not a just system of criminal law. That is not the just application of criminal law. And so adding that requirement again, has been viewed as a really important advance in the criminal law. The Eighth Amendment bans what is, again, a complex, kind of somewhat vague, phrase here. It bans cruel and unusual punishment. And again, the Eighth Amendment reads, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines be imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Now again, what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? The people who drafted that amendment probably didn't think that the death penalty itself amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, because the death penalty was something that existed. It was something that, it was not a routine thing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries by any means, but certain crimes would draw a death sentence in early America. And so they probably didn't mean the death penalty, but what they did mean were the kinds of medieval punishments that were routinely inflicted in Europe in the feudal era. Drawing and quartering, where you would attach a person's limbs to 4 different horses and pull them in opposite directions. Killing a person by breaking them on the rack, stretching, which is a similar type of thing, where you attach their arms and legs and just slowly pull them apart. That was viewed, burning a person at the stake. That was the sort of thing. Gratuitous torture, the infliction of pain and agony. Those sorts of punishments were what the Eighth Amendment was designed to preclude. But ultimately, the challenge is that our view of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment is subject to interpretation, and it tends to evolve. Okay, in the second and third and fourth decades of the 19th century, a very strong religious revival came, swept the nation, and one of the issues that galvanized a lot of people was whether or not the death penalty, should be continued to be practiced. And people who were part of this religious movement made the argument that the infliction of death constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And so historically, the challenge has been, I'll add another point, the Civil War came along, and in the aftermath of the Civil War, people's attitudes towards the death penalty shifted significantly, because the sustained violence of the Civil War sort of coarsened people and made them more inured to, again, the infliction of death. And there were people out there that said, yes, there are certain people out there that deserve to be strung up. And that was the sort of attitude that we oftentimes talk about the Wild West, and that sort of attitude really had its reflection in the mores of that period of time, which many Americans still think somehow were idealized. So the Supreme Court has struggled to identify the conditions under which the death penalty can survive constitutional challenge. And again, the problem often is, what are the means used to kill a person? For a long time, of course, hanging was a common method of execution. The problem is that hanging is a very precise thing, that you have to get things just right. You have to tie the knot in just such a way. You have to place the knot behind a person's ears so it will snap their neck. If you don't, and if the drop that is going to kill the person is not long enough, if they don't fall enough, something like 2 or 3 feet, you'll simply be strangling them to death, which is, I think most people would probably agree is cruel. If the drop is too far, if you drop them from more than 5 feet, the likelihood is that you're going to rip the person's head off. Is that not a gratuitous display of cruelty? Again, it depends on your viewpoint, and it depends on the community that is making these kinds of decisions. The court has ultimately held that certain forms of execution are defensible. The electric chair has been viewed as defensible. Most states have opted for death by lethal injection. And for the most part, lethal injection involves a 3-drug cocktail. There are 3 drugs that are introduced into a person's veins in sequence. The first one is an anesthetic that renders the person unconscious. The second one stops the person from breathing, and the third one stops their heart. Now, here's a problem. Both my parents were nurse anesthetists, and I can tell you that there are certain people, especially people who are, who have been convicted of murder, who oftentimes are drug addicts and are highly resistant to anesthesia. And so they are perhaps, they have been rendered unconscious but aware. And so they are aware when their lungs are stopped by the drug, and they are aware when their heart is stopped by the drug. Does that constitute cruel and unusual punishment? Many advocates of the death penalty say, think about what was done that caused them to be convicted, and think about the harms done to the victims. Well, is that really the criterion that we need to be using as a nation? The court has narrowed the scope of the death penalty's application. Rape is no longer a crime that will draw the death penalty. Likewise, there are certain categories of people. People with diminished capacity cannot be executed because you have to be able to demonstrate in a death penalty case that a person was aware of the depravity of their crime and nevertheless did it. Likewise, people of certain age, you cannot execute a child, like a 14-year-old, because again, 14-year-olds lack what most moral psychologists will tell you, that a 14-year-old oftentimes will lack an awareness of the moral consequences of their actions. So again, that creates a limitation. That school shooter in Georgia is talking about trying them as an adult. But the likelihood is they will not be able to get, to apply the death penalty to them because that person is still a child, a depraved child, but nevertheless still a child. The right to privacy means the right to be left alone, okay? This is another thing where there is no constitutional amendment that says citizens of the United States and inhabitants of the United States have a constitutional right to privacy. So the origins of the right to privacy actually come from a famous legal scholar and Supreme Court justice, a guy by the name of Louis Brandeis, the first, I believe, Jewish person to serve on the Supreme Court. He co-authored a famous Harvard Law Review article entitled "The Right to Privacy," which for the authors meant, again, the right to be left alone. We should note that the inspiration for this article were the crude intrusions of the late 19th century society columns in the huge newspapers of the day. It was sort of a lady Whistledown on steroids for those of you who watch the Bridgerton series on one of the cable channels. Those society pages routinely published the most private doings of members of high society in the United States at that period of time. And they were scandalous, and they were humiliating to people of a certain social station. Okay, so likewise again with the politics of eminent domain, you have the government's right to seize property for public use. That is also known as the Takings Clause, but it requires government to show a public purpose and to provide just compensation. Now, oftentimes, just compensation might be at the lower end of the market, but nevertheless, that is one of the, and it reflects this idea that your private property can be abridged for a public purpose. When we think about privacy, though, we are often talking about matters related to sex, to reproductive rights, and also to end-of-life issues. okay? The first time you actually see kind of a substantive due process claim used to create a constitutional right was the case Griswold v. Connecticut in 1966. And this was a woman by the name of Edith Griswold, who was a feminist of that era. And she believed that women's reproductive rights were systemically being violated. And she believed that reproductive health was a major issue. So she actually opened a clinic with a doctor where they provided family planning advice and contraceptives. She was arrested under a Connecticut law that banned the manufacture and sale of contraceptives. Again, at that time, Connecticut was dominated by Catholic Americans, and over the course of time, a state law had been passed that probably in the 19th century that banned, again, the manufacture and sale and distribution of contraceptives. So in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights combined establish zones of privacy. And the guy that drafted, I think it was William O. Douglas, I could be wrong, the guy that drafted the opinion basically said that the first, Third, Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments and Ninth Amendment establish penumbras, these shadows that amount to something fundamental that was left unarticulated in the Constitution, and that was the right to privacy. And again, the argument was that if privacy means anything, it means the right to make decisions about when you will begin a family, when you will expand your family. And again, this is an issue that is raised, today with the abortion issue. In Roe versus Wade in 1973, Harry Blackmun, who was the author of the Supreme Court's decision, established sort of a trimester-based, rule, a test regarding when the state can regulate access to an abortion. So in the first trimester, from months 1 to 3, women have an absolute right to terminate a pregnancy at any time. In the second and third trimesters, the state begins to have an interest in that pregnancy. And again, Nikki Haley at one point said, can't we all agree that late-term abortion should be illegal? And a lot of abortion rights advocates said, no, because most late-term abortions, in fact, nearly all late-term abortions, occur because there is something going wrong with the pregnancy, because the pregnancy has proven to be unviable, because the placenta ruptured early, or because it was a fallopian pregnancy, or because some horrific birth defect has rendered the pregnancy and the fetus unviable. These are the things that cause late-term abortions. Okay. In 2022, in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, reversed Roe and returned the issue to the states. Now, they basically, Samuel Alito, who wrote the majority opinion, basically said that Roe versus Wade was egregiously wrong when it was drafted, that there is no presumed right to an abortion in the Constitution. But they didn't say that abortion was somehow illegal. What they said was that the states need to make their own decisions. And many states, that again, Republican-dominated states like Oklahoma, had trigger laws already on the books that were designed to basically say the minute Roe versus Wade is overturned, we are going this law will automatically be put into effect that will ban abortions. And many states have 6-week bans. Many states have just absolutely banned all abortion, with only exceptions for the life and health of the mother. Some states have exceptions for rape and incest. There was a case in Ohio where a 10-year-old girl, a child, was raped by a family member. So it was both rape and incest. And she had to travel to Indiana to have that pregnancy terminated. And there have been, again, that is placing a child in a horrific situation. If you are absolutely pro-life in all situations, you would make the argument that a 10-year-old girl who may have gone through puberty early, but who is nevertheless, still a child, you would want to carry that child, force them to carry that child to term, that fetus, a child carrying a fetus to term. I strain to understand the morality behind that conclusion. I think that I think absolute logical consistency makes us reach insane conclusions when you say that abortion is wrong in every circumstance. What's going to happen to substantive due process? Clarence Thomas issued a concurring opinion in Dobbs that basically called for substantial repeals of previous precedents on cases involving substantive due process. And substantive due process refers to the legal rationale that the Fifth and the 14th Amendments due process clauses extend legal protections to rights not expressly listed or enumerated in the Bill of Rights or subsequent amendments. Clarence Thomas argued that in rejecting the legal protection for women's right to abortion, the court could subsequently use the same reasoning to overturn other rights based on substantive due process, including the right to access to contraception and the right to same-sex marriage. However, in the majority opinion in Dobbs, Samuel Alito declared that nothing in his opinion should be understood to cast doubt on precedents that do not concern abortion. So again, you also have another challenge, which is a law passed in 1986 called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA, which basically obligates hospitals to provide emergency care for people in any kind of medical crisis. And so that has been adjudicated. Idaho actually has, again, one of the strictest anti-abortion laws on the books. They were challenged under the interpretation of that law with the federal court, the Biden administration basically saying that they're violating EMTALA with their legal prohibitions. And the forced treatment of women. In many of these states, women are being turned away by doctors and hospitals and their legal counsels that are basically saying, we can't do anything to you until you're nearly dying. I think on its face, that is a violation of EMTALA. Nevertheless, doctors are risk averse when it comes to going to jail. And so their tendency will be to say, we're not going to put ourselves in legal jeopardy. We are going to wait until it's clear that this person is experiencing a medical emergency before we are going to intervene. And women are dying as a result of that. Again, this is a situation where the law is creating some really horrific situations. This is the current state. This is the Washington Post's current situation. The dark red states are instances where abortion is banned or mostly banned. The darker states are instances where a ban is imminent. The orange states are states where abortion bans were blocked by federal courts. The gray state, and that's really kind of Montana and Kansas and Iowa and Nebraska. These are states where, again, it's legal for now. And then the mauve states, I don't know what that color is. I think it's kind of a mauve color. Those are states where, again, these are states that are where voters are, again, dominated by, Democratic voters, by liberals, and where abortion is likely to remain legal unless Republicans win control of Congress and the White House and pass a national abortion ban. And this has become a campaign issue. Donald Trump is fully aware that abortion is not a winning issue for Republicans. It's a classic, what we call a wedge issue, where their public stances are now at odds with a significant majority of voters. There are a larger number now of single issue voters where their one issue, their one criteria for voting for someone is basically whether their views reflect their beliefs on abortion. That is a very uncomfortable position for Republicans to be in. And there have been states, like in Kansas, where they tried to pass a constitutional amendment through a referendum, basically saying that that abortion is not covered by the Constitution, so that their legislature could ban it. And 60% of Kansans, which is a very conservative state, rejected that constitutional amendment. A similar thing happened in Kentucky. So you're really looking at situations where a lot of women Republican voters are increasingly on the fence because of reproductive rights. Sexual orientation, again, you have the issue of this was a precedent that where there originally, again, it was not a good precedent for the LGBTQ plus community. Bowers versus Hardwick. Michael Bowers was a bartender. He was caught urinating in public. He was issued a bench warrant. Police went to, because he thought he'd paid the fine, but a bench warrant was issued. Police entered his home because a roommate allowed him in, and he was caught in bed with another man. The police arrested him under a Georgia sodomy law, and the court basically upheld the law, basically saying that homosexual activity was not protected by a right to privacy. However, in 2003, in a kind of similar situation where I can't remember Lawrence's name, but he was a gay man living with another gay man. A neighbor who had a spat with him made a false police call, and when police came to his home, again they entered, found him in a compromising position, arrested him under a Texas sodomy law. The Supreme Court held that in fact that people of that persuasion, that members of the LGBTQ plus community, do in fact have a constitutional right to privacy. Likewise, in 2015, and I want to point this out. In 2015, and actually a little bit before that, Barack Obama really, and actually before the 2012 election, Barack Obama basically said, "I don't want to get out in front of this issue. I am." I'm reflecting basically the Defense of Marriage Act position, which is that states shouldn't have to respect other states' same-sex marriage covenants. But in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, again, the Supreme Court held that same-sex couples had a right to marry and also had a right to the kind of civil rights that married couples have. That you have a right to be present if your loved one is incapacitated. That you have a right to be included in a will. That you have a right, basically that a husband would have with a wife, or a wife would have with a husband in a opposite sex couple. In 2020, the Supreme Court also concluded that the Civil Rights Act prohibited employment discrimination based on, again, sexual orientation. So, what do we think? Civil liberties lies at the heart of Americans' vision of government. However, civil liberties often comes with trade-offs and balancing of different rights. The old proverb is, freedom for the wolf is death for the sheep. And that, that phrase again is one of my favorites, and it reflects this idea that we both have to limit the power of government. We also have to limit the power of majorities in communities that otherwise would seek to infringe upon the rights of others, not for necessarily good reasons, okay? So quick Q&A. Why should a cake decorator be compelled to decorate a cake for a same-sex couple if they sincerely believe that doing so is a violation of their religious beliefs? This is the balancing act that we're talking about, right? And again, the point is this person is basically making the argument that I am an artist and that I should be protected, in the expression of my art by my religious beliefs. Now, historically, and this is a case has been upheld. But historically, people who engage in commerce do not, your practice of commerce does not allow you to use your religious beliefs to discriminate. Nevertheless, right now, people do have that right because of a Supreme Court case that was actually cooked up by activist, religious rights activists. In a related question, why can't a coach be allowed to kneel at midfield and pray following a game? Is the coach's free, is that not the coach's free exercise of religion? This was a case that I talked about, Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, with the court concluding in 2022 that Joe Kennedy had a right to kneel at midfield and pray, with the important caveat that he was not pressuring others to join him at midfield. Now, for religious conservatives, the court's decision represented a big victory for freedom of religious expression. However, as the dissenting justices pointed out, the majority opinion written by Neil Gorsuch fundamentally misrepresented the nature of the case. Since the court's decision in Lemon versus Kurtzman, students and faculty have been allowed to engage in quiet, private prayer. That is, prayer that does not require other participants. Coach Joseph Kennedy's prayers at midfield, characterized by the majority opinion as, as the coach quietly kneeling, was in fact a motivational prayer that Kennedy led, where he was placing pressure on players to join him at midfield. And in fact, at one point, he would hold up a helmet from both teams, where both the members of both teams would kneel before him while he was praying. Student athletes on Kennedy's teams felt compelled to join in those post-game prayers because they were afraid they wouldn't get playing time if they didn't participate. Likewise, the court's decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District actually overturned two precedents, one established by Lemon versus Kurtzman, and another case in 1992, Lee versus Weissman, which barred school districts from coercing students into a religious exercise. And so, to me, I think the Supreme Court got this case wrong. They erred on the side of free exercise of one person, but in so doing, they have entangled the state in religious considerations. And that is going to sow confusion and conflict in the future. And it's going to coerce people in ways that they're not going to like, and it's going to lead to more legal cases. So, by now we have learned that the issue of civil liberties is a complex one. When we come back next week, we're going to learn about further complexities, and that is the issue of civil rights, where certain groups of people have been systematically subjected to discrimination on the basis of race, color, gender, or sexual orientation. I'll see you next time.